Welcome to the Connected podcast, a new series that explores issues within the higher education community through conversations and reflections with guests, helping us to stay connected. In Series 1, we speak to educators from across the higher education sector to get their thoughts on all things connected to relational pedagogy. Kicking off our first episode is Dr Jo Hartland. Jo is a senior lecturer and the Deputy Director of Education at Bristol Medical School. Their work focuses on co-production with students and the public, representing the voices of marginalised identities in healthcare curriculums with a focus on LGBTQ+ identities. Okay, welcome to Jo. Thank you so much for joining me today. And first of all, congratulations on your very recent NTF award. Amazing. You've been doing some really groundbreaking work in the field of healthcare education. So just to start, I wonder if you'd like to tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and a little bit about you.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name's Jo, my pronouns are they, them. I'm a senior lecturer and the Deputy Education Director at Bristol Medical School. My work, so I trained as a medic, and then I worked in the NHS for 5 years, and then I eventually left, and I've been working in higher education for another 5, nearly 6 years now. And during my time in education, my work has really been focused on the idea of how do we bring in the voices of marginalised communities into health education, a place that has historically excluded, and you could argue deliberately or not, excluded these individuals under quite colonial systems of oppression. And so a lot of the work that I do thinks about not only how do we bring those voices in, but also what does it mean to think about systems of knowledge that we value and whose knowledge we value over others, and why do we do that? And then additionally, I do a lot of work around supporting student experience whilst at university, again focused on our marginalised students and trying to improve their experience of study at the university. And then nationally, I'm co-chair of the Medical Schools Council Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Alliance that looks at advising medical schools UK-wide on that kind of work. So I get to work with a lot of very lovely peers from across the UK on that, which is really exciting.
Oh, it sounds tremendous work and so vital. And I imagine with all of those different roles, obviously you've got a really strong personal commitment to the work that you're doing, and you very much I think your PVC was talking about how kind of open and vulnerable you have to be in this workspace, and I just wonder how that's kind of informed your kind of teaching practice, or how that's kind of maybe changed your kind of teaching identity as the years have kind of rolled on.
Yeah, I think the work that I do, I think, requires a lot of transparency and honesty. I'm a big fan of making sure that, I think part of thinking about power dynamics that exist in classrooms, that exist, whether that's between educator and student or a guest speaker from the community that you might have in or whatever, I think there's a lot to be said for honesty and transparency, because I think we're probably all really familiar with the fact that universities deliberately are quite complex machines, and it can be very hard to figure out who is doing what and why is that person here, and what is the point of this, and so a big part of my work involves trying to bring transparency and honesty, but then that also includes about my own identity. And there's two things I tend to do with that. One is I like to be really transparent about my own learning journey. So I'll talk about the fact that, when I first started at the university, I never thought of myself as being someone who was racist, but I certainly wasn't someone who was anti-racist. And my journey in improving my work as an ally and looking at what it means for me to be engaging in anti-racism work in higher education and healthcare has been super informed by and almost in many ways led by my students and the community members that I work with, because I think it's required a lot of self-reflection to be able to go, hey, actually, that this I don't know enough, and I need to work harder on this, and I need to continue working hard on this because this isn't something you stop doing. And that even applies to things where like my own identity aligns with that. So whether that's with the queer community, I only represent a small part of that. I need to be able to engage with other voices and learn from people. Um, and likewise, I'm somebody who has a disability, and it took a really long time for me to bring my identity as a disabled person into my teaching, despite having been a disabled student for a very long time. Um, the queerness, the way that I present myself around students, I try and role model for them. I try and say, here is someone who uses they, them pronouns, who has different styles of dress, who is here, and that means you have a legitimate place here as well. But for disability, it took me a really long time to accept that. So I think, like, my advice for anyone thinking about this would be that it is vulnerable, and maybe not everything has to come out all at once, because that's a huge amount to bring to the table. But I do think my vulnerability, I think, empowers the teaching, and I also use it, this is the second thing, as a way to invite compassion into the classroom. So a lot of my work involves teaching about, for instance, trans healthcare and trans rights and the rights of LGBTQ plus people in healthcare. And one of the reasons I am transparent about my own identity within that space is I deliberately say to people, it's fine for you to ask questions, but I invite you to ask them with compassion, um, because that is part of their learning, and their discomfort of seeing me or having to ask questions of me is important, but it shouldn't then come across as kind of something that then hurts me. So for a long time, I wasn't doing that. And now I think I'm trying to protect myself a little bit more in those spaces and not shut down conversation, but just say, I need you to think about what you're saying before you say it, so that you consider what identities and that outside of this teaching, there's an impact on me. Um, and I think that took a really long time for me to develop the confidence to do that. But I think it's been essential for keeping myself well doing the work. So yeah, I don't know if that really answered the question, but those are my thoughts on that.
I've got so many questions, 3,000 questions, so I'll try and pick a couple of sensible ones. So just thinking, so many reflections there on kind of, again, how you bring your own kind of lived experience into the classroom, if you like, which is again what this whole kind of conversations around kind of this idea of kind of identity. And I wonder if there was if you've got kind of, or you can think of a particular experience from your life that maybe significantly changed your perspective on teaching.
So the first time I got engaged in wanting to make curriculum change and wanting to like see myself better represented, and was as a medical student. And I had a couple of incidences as a medical student where there were quite overt forms of discrimination. You'll see in other interviews I do, I talk about an issue I had at medical school with a consultant giving out a book on how to practice medicine according to Christ, and in it teaching about how to cure gay people, how to not give pain relief to people who are giving childbirth, who are having who during childbirth because of original sin and things like this. And I challenged that as a student, and I remember it was a very difficult and long process to get anything to happen. And I was asked by my school at the time, do you really want to be known as the troublemaking gay? And then like the ongoing joke I have is that like that's how I made my career, right? I made a career out of being the troublemaking gay. But I think that was a pivotal moment for me of seeing actually a really bad example of education, about how if left unchallenged, if there weren't voices challenging that narrative that no one else said anything. None of the educators, the medical school, none of my peers said anything, and how important it is to have people in places who recognize the privilege of what education is and the long-lasting impact that it has on people when it's done well and when it's done less well. And so I think that was one of the key moments that kind of kicked me into thinking this needs to be, there needs to be other voices here. There needs to be people who can, that troublemaking gay, or that troublemaking Black woman, or that troublemaking disabled person, they need to be in the faculty. They need to have voices here. And I guess that's most of what my career has then sort of ended up focusing on is how do we make sure those voices are heard?
Yeah, 100%. So thinking about all of those different voices, how do you address kind of the intersectionality of those identities in your classroom?
Yeah, so a huge amount of my work revolves around, so especially my community engagement work, there's a lot of working with people before they come into the classroom. So planning teaching can be months and months and months in advance because there has to be at least a couple meetings with individuals to, one, for me to explain what things like the General Medical Council want from us, because unfortunately, well, fortunately or not, we have to conform to, you know, our regulators, but also to make sure that I understand what they want to tell in that room. How do I keep them safe in that room? Are there things that are out of bounds in that room? Like, what have I got to do that to make sure that they feel like, I'm not sure the word empowered is a particularly good one because it's quite a colonial one, but that they are safe and that they have a voice. And then I think there's a real recognition of deliberately going out and searching for people who represent those who are most oppressed. Because, you know, when I first started in this work, we have some amazing disabled speakers at the time, although many of them have retired now, but you know, they were predominantly of a white demographic, of a slightly older demographic. They were people who had the ability to take time off or come in, or they were retired, right? So like their voices were heard because they were present. And so, you know, I'm working with Dr. Nazanin Ressa, who's I line manage, and she's looking at ethical forms of engagement with communities. That means what do we need to do? Do we need to, so I cover their travel in, they are paid. They get my time beforehand so that we can go over the teaching. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that this isn't costing them something and that they feel respected as part of the process. But I think if you want intersectional voices, you have to acknowledge that these people aren't just going to appear, right? And they're not just going to jump out of the woodwork and be there. You've actually got to go and do the recruitment and put the effort in, go to community spaces. You have to step outside of your university bubble in order to do that, because universities exclude those people. And then I think if the question is also about the students in the classroom, I think sharing my intersectional identity can help. I think we deliberately teach on the issue of intersectionality, like we make it a very explicit thing that we talk about. But also, I think what people sometimes don't recognize, especially with students, is in medicine anyway, we have them for 5 or 6 years. So they evolve over time. They change. They may change their religion, their gender, their sexuality. They may acquire disabilities. There's all different things that might happen to those individuals. And I think there has to be a recognition of change as part of like your intersectionality work. You have to be able to recognize that privilege is not something that you hold on to forever, and different privileges can be very rapidly lost or gained. As a queer person who came out as genderqueer, I was, you know, surprised by how presenting more feminine on a night out, for instance, really makes me feel less safe. So I guess for me, the intersectionality thing is sometimes used very loosely, and it's sometimes used very, yes, we should be intersectional. And I think it's really important for anybody to examine what they mean when they say this and what effort they're putting into actually doing that. Because if you don't go and look for those voices and create spaces so they feel safe, you're never going to get intersectionality really represented. You're going to get the intersectionality of the most privileged.
Yeah, 100%. So again, sticking with that kind of theme, in what ways do you think that unexamined identities can affect teaching effectiveness?
Can you clarify what you mean by unexamined identities?
So I guess those ones that have been, I guess like you were saying there, those ones that maybe are unheard or have yet to, again, perhaps people not feeling safe in those environments, so yet wanting to disclose a particular identity. How can that for student or educator kind of affect that relationship or the effectiveness of the teaching and the learning that goes on in that space?
So I think in particularly looking at students, one of the things that I'm really aware of is if we look at disclosure of disability, for instance, what we know from a lot of data is that Black men are less likely to disclose disability. So at universities and medical schools, we tend to see disclosure of disability taking place later on. So in years 3, 4, 5, it doesn't happen in year 1 and 2. And I think that's vital when you think about the accessibility needs for somebody to actually be able to flourish in education. We have to have an accessible environment. We don't have universal accessibility. So if you don't have a space where someone feels they can safely disclose mental health to you, for instance, that's a huge issue in the healthcare community, is not disclosing mental health for fear of being seen as dangerous. Or not disclosing a disability because you're already having to deal with the impact of racism, and maybe you're not ready to add ableism to that as well. If you aren't creating environments where people can disclose safely, if they don't know what is going to happen when they disclose, if they don't know what's going to happen with that information, who gets it and how is it seen, people will never do it. So I guess that comes back to our earlier point about transparency as well, about like why tell the uni? We need to be able to make sure that students and staff know that sharing parts of their identity like this, those unheard, those unspoken, those things that can really in a classroom create an unseen level of disruption. If we don't create the space for those people to know what will happen when they disclose it, and we don't continue to prove that disclosure is safe and it is something that will benefit them, then they're never going to do it. And that's hard because it means that, right at the start of it, you've got if people aren't willing to disclose, you've got to try and fight that battle to show them that they'll be safe. But I guess that's why I think those of us who are able to hold privilege and able to role model should do that if we can. And that's not to say that I've done it and it's always been successful, it's always been safe. But I hope that my disclosures will then promote students to do so, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, that whole thing of coming back to that kind of safety, it's again for educators in that space and for students in that space, as you say, to understand not just perhaps in that environment what support is maybe available or what might look like for students, but also for obviously the educators that might be disclosing, who are concerned that that might impact on their career or their aspirations in some way. I wonder then what role you feel that reflection, because obviously within education and certainly within healthcare professions, obviously reflection, clinical reflection is a big part of our kind of practice. I just wonder what role you feel kind of reflection has played in the understanding of your, I guess, your personal identity, but also in your kind of your teaching identity as well.
So I think I think I was kind of rather appropriately, but like forcefully put in the position of needing to be more reflective in the role that I did, because the more I worked with students, the more they gave often quite unfiltered feedback. And I think, especially when you're working in a system where like you're doing your best to make change, when you hear negative feedback, when you hear things that you have to, there's a huge amount of reflection that needs to take place so that you're not taking it personally, so that you are able to see and listen to the frustrations of others and recognize that these are symptoms of system-wide issues, and that you becoming defensive of a system is going to support nobody. So I think for me, becoming reflective has meant examining my discomfort, my emotions, whether I feel sad or angry or whatever, because especially when working with students, I need to make sure that I'm compassionately considering their position. You know, they don't understand how the universities work. You know, a huge amount of my work with some of the students who I do paid work with to examine some of the work we do, a lot of what I have to do at the start of that is teach them what is a faculty, what is a school, what is a program, what can we control, what can't we control. We don't control the NHS. So like as a medical school, there's a limited amount we can do. And if your problems are in the NHS, we can only advocate. We can't like, so like, there's a lot of trying to help them understand that. But at the same time, I also have to like hold on to the idea that they don't understand that. And so when they say, oh, the medical school's rubbish because of this or whatever, often they don't mean the medical school. Or if they do mean the medical school, they mean systems that I also think are rubbish, and it's not about me. But I guess when you put your head often above the parapet, when you're often getting, when you're the person who has to say the things that make people uncomfortable, you can get quite defensive about the work quite quickly. And I think, you know, there was an event this week I was meant to be doing in which I was meant to be running a workshop on disability and reasonable adjustments as a disabled person and as a somebody who was that disabled student who wasn't supported or accommodated for. Because of some other stuff that's going on at the moment and just feeling a little bit burnt out, I've had to sort of pull out of this and rebook it, because I just felt I don't think I can go into that classroom and handle the questions and the interrogation and the what ifs in a way that would actually be helpful to them as learners, the staff, because I'm going to get annoyed. I don't have the robustness this week to be able to do that. And that's not common. I normally can, but I thought this week where I was like, actually, no, this isn't going to help anyone. I'm going to become antagonistic. They will become more antagonistic. This isn't, you know. So I think you also have to recognize not only like your own safety and stuff like that, but also if you're not in a place, we often talk about the idea that learners have to be ready to learn, right? But teachers have to be ready to teach. So you need to be able to think about what are you going in there with and doing. And if you're not well or you're not ready or psychologically there's going to be a problem, either don't do it or go in. And if you feel you can, and I will often do this with classrooms, I would say, hey, folks, I'm pretty tired today. If I'm a little bit blunt, I don't mean it. It's just sometimes when I get tired, I become a little bit blunt, and I will probably self-correct. But please don't take that to heart. If I look a bit confused at you or I'm frowning a little bit, I just try and give context to my identity, because neurodiversity can sit a bit weirdly when you're tired and people think you're being like rude or something. But I think there's something about honesty and transparency can actually make a lot of people feel safer.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it goes back to, I think, us all remembering that everybody in that space is human, and nobody is perfect. And actually, when we're trying to be curious and we're trying to learn, and we want those answers to the questions and we're not sure how to ask them because they may be tricky or awkward or completely out of our lived experience, you know, it sometimes is clumsy, and we will get it wrong. But like you say, being honest and setting up the context so that you're in a space that works and is functional and does its job doesn't always mean, I think sometimes, again, it's that journey, isn't it? It won't always feel safe, even if it's set up to be a safe space, because you yourself feel really vulnerable asking the question that's going to perhaps most transform your learning.
100%. And I think, you know, one of the things I will often say in those spaces is like, I have some ground rules often when I start, and I'll say like, I might give you feedback on the way that you ask a question. This is not a critique. This is not me telling you off. That's part of the learning. You are also welcome to give me feedback if you want to. I'm not going to get everything right. That would be impossible. One of the things I talk about in my teaching is fear, and that people often don't engage with this work because they fear getting it wrong. They fear causing offense. And one of the things I say to them is, you will get it wrong. You will cause offense at some point. I have, and I do. But your success at this sort of work isn't solely defined by getting it right all the time. It's also what you do when you get it wrong. How do you behave when you get it wrong? Do you learn and grow and change, or do you become angry and defensive and aggressive and repeat a cycle of harm? So I think it's really important for us to like have that, and to also recognize that it's okay for you to say in a space, if someone is asking a question, and again, I think this is a healthy ground rule to set up, is boundaries, and to say, you're welcome to ask questions. I will tell you if I'm not comfortable answering them.
Absolutely.
Because, and I'm not sure what your experience with health education is, but especially with medical students, they sometimes can sometimes feel a little bit like, if someone's in the classroom as an example of a patient, for instance, something like that, it's not just medical students really, it's doctors, it's everybody. There's an idea that we're entitled to know everything about them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, no, you earn that. You earn it by making them feel safe, by making them feel able to disclose. So you're not entitled to any of that. You have to like, as a learner, part of your learning is, how do I work with somebody and gain their confidence so they share things with me, right? And that's not going to be an easy thing for you to do. Like that's,
yeah,
it's
and I
hard.
think it's, again, isn't it? It's that relationship of working out, you know, as the learner, are you asking that question just because you're curious to know more about the person? Does that give you a better holistic, I guess, idea or information about that person as a whole, to know more about perhaps how that, I don't know, whatever difficulty that they're presenting with, illness, what have you, that for them to do that diagnosis or to perhaps propose a better intervention? Or is there a really key bit of information they need to be able to make the diagnosis? And I think as a learner, it's really important when you're thinking about the questions that you're asking your patients, your clients, is this something that I need to know right now to make a safe diagnosis? Is this something that's going to better inform my decision making for an intervention, if that's what's required? Or am I just being nosy and want to know the answer?
Exactly. I mean, I talk about that in my lectures as polite inquiry, and I say, like, it doesn't matter how polite your language is. If your intention is just for your own gain, it's not really polite. It's just being nosy. And, you know, I work a lot in trans healthcare, and trans people are very familiar with this. They go in because they have a sore throat, and they end up getting interrogated about their genitals. That can be done in a way where the person's like, oh, I think I don't often meet trans patients. I can learn something here. This is an interesting thing for me. They're sick. They don't want to talk to you about that, right? Like, just think a little bit about the context. And I think in a classroom setting, if you're unsure about a question as a learner, one thing I try and encourage people to do is say, I have a question, but I don't know how to ask it. And just be honest about the fact that you're not sure, because that will help the person educating you to help you navigate how to ask the question.
Yeah.
So they might then say, okay, what's the question about? Is the question about this? Is the question about that? Oh, it's about that. Okay, so what are you trying to? We can then help you build up what it would look like. But again, that requires that honesty, that transparency, that ability to go, ooh, I'm really uncomfortable asking this and I don't know why.
It's a really powerful strategy, though, isn't it, to actually connect with that person and together shape a question that then gives the person being asked some control and some choice about, you know, the question being posed, but also gives the learner then the information to be able to, you know, develop
and context as well. You know, I often work with colleagues who I'll explain that some of our global majority students get very anxious about the question, where are you from? Because it's often been used as a form of aggression. You know, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Brighton. No, where are you really from? Where are you really from? Until they find out some heritage that isn't from the UK, because they might be black or brown. And that way of targeting somebody means that doesn't matter what your intention is of the question when you meet them. Also, where are you from? They will be apprehensive about it. And so it's an awareness that your language happens in the context of someone else's past experiences. It's not just you saying something. They have a history to those words. So then my educators will say, so I can never ask a student where they're from. And I'm like, no, you can ask it, but give context. Have an awareness and some compassion for the idea that this might be a phrase that has resulted in difficulty for them. So when I have new students, I will say to them, it's really helpful for me as your tutor to know just a little bit more about you. So tell me a little bit about where you're from. Where's family? And I let them know why I'm asking the question so that they're not thinking, what is the reason for this? And so that's part of that learning, is to start having the compassion and understanding of other people's experiences so that you will say things in a way that doesn't come across as harmful.
Yeah. And setting it up, really, isn't it? As part of that rapport building, that actually you're not just asking because, again, you're just being nosy. You're actually asking because you want to know a bit about them and you want to, you know, find out so that you can kind of establish that relationship. And often when you first got students, they're so nervous, aren't they, when they come out on placement, that actually just trying to have some kind of human, you know, what's your favourite thing for tea? You know, what do you like watching on the telly? Some of those connections can just really help settle some nerves, can't they, as well? So I'm just thinking then back to what we were talking about there in terms of, I guess, your inherent values and beliefs. I'm just wondering how you kind of incorporate those, and you've touched on this really with how you saying you've worked with kind of service users, but how do you really kind of try and incorporate your values and beliefs into your curriculum design, knowing that you have to balance kind of meeting the MNC requirements and, you know, the regulatory bodies? How do you still manage to bring Jo into that space?
I think I have to acknowledge that there's conflict between those spaces to start with, and then I think about, in that conflict, where is their resolution? How do I bring those two things together? And it's normally achievable. If there's something that I have to talk about, but it's something that I would find difficult, I make it very transparent that the reason I'm talking about it. So I might say, you know, this is part of, we have to talk to you about this because of this. I think I'm often accused of being too political or too activist for an academic, which I think is a really truly odd thing to say when my work is in health inequality, which is a political decision. And often what I will point out to people is what I've done is presented you with information. You are inferring a political stance from that. And yes, I do have a political stance, but you thinking that this is a criticism of a certain government or a certain issue or a certain thing is you interpreting the facts I've given you. That's not me being political. I've given you facts. You have received those facts and you've said, oh, that's bad. Therefore, I am being political because I'm criticizing the government or something like that. No, I'm just presenting you with the facts of inequality as they exist, right? These are just truths. And I think sometimes I think that actually there isn't such a big gap between me and those regulations and my identity and stuff. It's that gap is forced upon me, that like I am made political by my presence in those spaces, by my work, by the fact that I say things that are evidence-based and true, but are perhaps not what are commonly said. Now, I don't see that as being something that is misaligned or deeply in conflict with, like the role of a doctor, for instance. And so I guess part of like me coming to terms with this has been like me examining my relationship with professionalism. What does professionalism mean? What do all these things mean? And understanding where that's weaponized in order to create pockets of silence and in order to exclude certain people. And actually, there's no real grounding for it. There's no real reason that should be the case. And then I think it's about being brave and saying, well, there's nothing here that says I shouldn't be here, I shouldn't say this thing, or I shouldn't talk about this. It's all inferred. It's all secret, hidden whispers about what is and isn't professional to say or do. And I think it's also a very difficult thing sometimes for me to answer, because other people say, can you give me advice on how to do it myself? Like, how do I do this? And say, well, I can't. That's really hard, because if I want to, I can assume male privilege. I'm white. I can, if I focus, not pass as someone who's able-bodied, there are elements of privilege I hold that others do not hold. And that can keep me safe in those spaces. And so I'm never keen to give people advice on how they can do it. I think each person has to find what they're happy with and how they're comfortable with, like, having those conflicts and those dynamics together. The other thing is because of the way that I see the world, because of the sort of neurodiverse experiences that I have, I can sometimes overshare and not clock that that's an overshare. So sometimes I think people are like, that was really brave, and I'm like, oh, I didn't really think about that. so sometimes I think, I'm sometimes unnecessarily praised when actually it was just me, like, just oversharing and just being who I am as a person. But yeah, it's not easy, and I think every one individual has to come to that journey by themselves. I don't think you can, and it's also okay if it's not the same every day. Some days you're too tired.
Absolutely.
Some days there's something in the news that means that you don't feel like you have the energy for that space today, and so you hold it back, and that's not failing, that's looking after yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess thinking about kind of looking after yourself, I wonder whether there are any challenge that you've faced in I guess kind of navigating yourself and your identity and keeping yourself safe with those kind of institutional expectations or norms, and whether there's any any experiences along the journey that have been a barrier that you feel actually now is something that's overcome, and some of those systems are perhaps changing or shifting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question because it's sort of ongoing. There's been situations of my career being blocked, of like my progression being blocked, that have been very difficult. And I think when you are someone who brings their identity into the workplace, it's very easy to weaponize it, but also to deny you're doing that. And I think probably that's, you know, it's why people are scared of saying I'm queer, I'm disabled, I'm whatever, like, because it's really easy to weaponize those identities against people and make them feel less than or othered, or you know, that's a huge issue. I've also experienced a lot of violence associated with my identities. So my work in healthcare around trans healthcare and LGBT healthcare especially has resulted in death threats, in threats of sexual violence, in letter writing campaigns against me, accusing me of being a danger to women and children. And so there's a huge weaponization. When you say things that make systems uncomfortable, when you challenge power, they're always going to look for the things that they can do to hurt you. And I think that is why I have like regular therapy sessions, and why I talk about it so that people know it happens. And I'm very aware that when I go to a conference abroad, especially abroad, but also in the UK, and I present in a more feminine way, people look at me with disgust. And those are my colleagues. You know, transphobia is rife within both higher education in the UK, but also across the world. And so I think you have to like really understand and protect yourself in these spaces and realize that like systems are not there to do that for you. Like that's not what these institutions are built to do. And that's what, you know, most of my work is around challenging. But as it stands, it's not. Like the NHS is not, most higher education institutes are not built to keep people safe who don't fit into a very colonial system of who is seen as supreme. And so I think we are making changes towards that. But in the meantime, anybody who's working in this space, who is bringing that identity into work, who is finding that a problem, my advice is therapy. Like, it's really important that you're talking about this. It's remembering that it's not a failure to hold back sometimes, and to find community, to find people who also are struggling, because I think it can feel very isolating, and it really helps to know that there are other people out there who are going through this, or have been through this, or have some parallel understanding of it because of a different identity. I think, yeah, that would be my advice, I guess.
So with all that being said, and all kind of the challenges and the energy that it takes to show up in these spaces, what is it that keeps you here? You know, is it because, you know, you're doing, you know, amazing work, and the impact, you know, I can really see the impact of your work, but is it kind of seeing the students learning and the development, and seeing kind of them, you know, understanding and creating new meaning together? Is it kind of knowing that you know, changing, hopefully positively changing the experience for lots of other people who are coming into healthcare? Because we know there's that you know, huge barrier for anybody really with any difference coming into the you know, the systems of healthcare that we have. What is it that keeps you, what keeps you in this space?
I was going to be facetious and say a mortgage. No, it's interesting because, you know, like you said at the start, I recently got a National Teaching Fellowship award, which is amazing. But honestly, like the things that bring me far more joy are the messages from students when they come up and they tell you about the impact that it has on them as an individual. I have a folder. I always ask the students' permission, but I have a folder where I save their emails. about the difference that the work has made, the difference it means to see someone who's visible, the difference it made to hear someone challenge something. Because I think when you're fighting a behemoth of something as big as, you know, these systems are, not just within higher education but within society, you have to like hold on to those little wins, and like I said earlier, education has the ability to make huge, long-lasting impact. And I think we probably all remember those educators who made a difference to us. And so when I get those emails or those little ways of somebody indicating that I've made a difference, I think I just relate that back to my own experiences and then kind of hold on to it. And yeah, that's probably what keeps me going. More so than like, and this isn't to put the award down at all, but more so than bigger awards and things like that, is when you know that what you've said or what you've done, or even just being in the room, has made someone else feel safer. That I think for me is what I find most inspiring about it.
Yeah, it's coming back to those kind of personal connections, isn't it? And yeah, that kind of relationship between you and that student, and the power of the ripple effect, so one, changing something for that student, who knows where they'll end up in the NHS as a consultant, and who knows where in the future,
Well,
changing
exactly,
things for others.
and that's the power of educators, right? I recently was praising one of my colleagues, Margot, who's retiring soon, and was speaking about the generations of impact that she has had, not only on those students that she taught, but also on the students they teach. Like it's a huge thing, right? It ripples out. But also there's something about, I guess on a really personal level, there's something about me wanting to give this generation, or this current these students, the thing I didn't have. So like I want them to see something that I would have valued. And like if I can keep doing that, then I think that's a positive step, right? Like if I can keep giving them the thing that was missing for me, then hopefully by the time I get to the point where I'm too tired to do this anymore, someone else will be taking it up, and they will be the next step, right? They will be even more, right? They'll be even more than I was, and then the person following them gets to be even more than they were, right? Like that's the dream, I guess.
That's the hope, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. So finally, Jo, how do you kind of envision evolving as an educator, as the kind of understanding of yourself deepens over time, knowing that this is a lifelong journey?
I mean, my experience since I started, I guess that's a very personal question in a way, because when I was one of those people that went into a lockdown as one gender and came out as another, and but a huge part of that was leaving medicine and entering academia gave me space to reclaim parts of my identity that I felt weren't allowed. And I still don't know if they are allowed, but it felt safe, marginally safer to do it in academia, not all the time, but than it did in medicine. And I think that will continue. That ability, that if I continue to self-examine and I continue to realize that my relationship with myself, my body, my mind can evolve, and be informed by the work that I'm doing, I think that's really powerful. And as I said earlier, I've recently started line managing someone called Naz, who's a young, amazing young woman, and the amount I've learned since she started working with me, even though I'm her line manager in theory, has been amazing. So like I think a recognition that you as an educator can still learn is vital, right? Like as soon as I stopped doing that, I've pretty much stopped doing meaningful work, I would say.
Yeah, the learning never stops, does it?
Mm.
Jo, it's been so wonderful to talk to you, and thank you for continuing to be so open and vulnerable in sharing your experiences. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure that all of the listeners are going to be enriched for having heard your story today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Connected podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss our next conversation. Stay connected.